learning to work with algebra tiles. As with any manipulative, when you first give your students that opportunity, you need to make sure that they have time to play with it. In other words, as you're taking roll or as you're passing out papers, see that your students have the manipulatives on the desk so they can build designs with them, because they're going to do that anyway, and you may as well give them that time when you're not trying to teach. Now, the first thing that we would do with algebra tiles is do addition. So I always believe if you're going to start anything, you ought to have some kind of definition. So the first thing we want to start with is, what is addition? A lot of kids will say it's adding, but we don't use the word in its own definition. So I try and get the kids to give me some kind of definition like it is putting things together. And that's exactly what we're looking at, is we're trying to put things together to do addition. So that's where we would start. Now, what's going to seem a little bit odd is when we do addition of algebra tiles, we have to understand first the concept of what a neutral is. And a neutral is just a positive and a negative. Now, I'm going to use blue for positive and red for negative, because red would be negative in accounting anyway, but you can use color combination any way you want to. If I put a positive tile and a negative tile together, what that does, what we say, neutralizes or turns into a zero. Now, I can have as many zeros as I want, it still doesn't change matters anything. And so I will often ask my kids, if I have these tiles just out in space, okay, and they're like, positive ones are protons and negative ones are electrons, what happens then, electrically, is that they will form neutrals. And so I will get a positive charge of 1. And if you just do a little bit of introduction like that, kids kind of get the idea. So we're going to start with a simple addition problem that kids have seen time and time again, because you always start with prior learning. Now, what you need to make sure your students understand is that there are always zeros involved, or neutrals, whichever you choose to call them. And it doesn't matter how many, so usually I'll ask a student for a small number that they like, and that's the number of zeros I'll put up with. So if I say 3 plus 1, that simply means I am putting in 3 and I am adding 1. My zeros are up there, they don't affect my problem at all, but I get an answer of 4. Now, I do require that my students draw whatever I am doing, because I want them to make sure they also put it on paper, because I want the picture to become part of their memory process. Then we get into taking a look at negative and positive numbers. So if I am adding a negative 3 with a positive 1, I still have my neutrals up there, and I would say, okay, negative 3 in this case is 3 of the red ones, so I would put those in, and then I'm putting in the positive 1. So when I put in the positive 1, that's going to create a neutral. So when I do that, and I can show the negatives, usually I do that on paper by putting negative signs in them. If I put that with my positive 1, then that's going to neutralize. And that's going to give me the value of negative 2. And for addition of integers, it's whatever is not neutralized. Whatever doesn't turn into a 0 is your answer. So you can have as many numbers as you want. You can try several examples, but kids pick this up pretty fast. So if I want to add the example of, say, negative 2 plus a negative 1, then I just start out with my negative 2. I put in a negative 1, and I'm left with negative 3. And so again, I can show that with the 2 that I put to start with, and then the negative 1, and I have an answer of negative 3. Okay? Now, what I usually do when I start is I let kids know that if I have negative numbers, I'm going to put them in parentheses, because I believe my job is to make it easier on students not to confuse them. Later on, once they get used to them, I don't need the parentheses, but when I start off with it, it's a good idea, so the kids will know, oh, that's a negative sign, and they don't get confused about whether it is subtraction or it's addition. So basically, that's all there is to addition. And then the next thing we would get into would be subtraction. Now, obviously, you're going to gear this to the level of student that you have, to the age level, to how fast you should move. Addition might be one thing you do in one day. I usually take one day to do the addition, and then by the next day I'm ready to do subtraction. Now, in addition, I really didn't use the neutrals, but we get the kids used to it because they have to have them in subtraction. Again, I'm going to start with a definition. So usually what my students will say is that subtraction is taking away. And that's a really good definition because they're used to calling it takeaways when they were in elementary school. But I have to get them also to understand that you're taking away from something. If they don't get this concept of from something, then the problem is they just start taking things off the paper and they don't have something to start off with. So, again, it's always a good idea to start with an example that the kids would know from past experience. So if I simply say, I've got 4 and I'm going to take away 1. Well, let's say I start off with my 3 neutrals here. And I say, all right, the something that I have is the 4. So I've got 4 positive tiles, and so I would draw my 4, and that's what I have in my problem is 4. And if I'm going to take away, it simply means take it off. Or in my drawing, it means cross it out. So when I take away, I then have 3. Now the concept is true whether I'm working with a positive or a negative number. So if I say, all right, I want to have 3, and now I want to take away a negative 2. Okay, so the something that I have is my 3. So I start off with my 3, and I want to take away a negative 2, but I notice that I don't have any negatives there. And one thing I've noticed I've just done is I haven't written in my neutrals that I need to make sure my kids will see, so I need them to make sure they're writing down the neutrals too. So I have that in my problem. I've got my 3 I'm starting with, but I don't have a negative 2 there. And that's what the neutrals are for. I'm going to go into my neutrals, and I'm going to take away a negative 2. When I take away that negative 2, that means that I now have 3 positives and 2 more positives, so that's going to give me a value of 5. And so I can take a positive, I can take away some negatives. My answer is always going to be those numbers that aren't neutral. I don't count the zeros because 0 doesn't give it a value. I just count the tiles that don't have a 0. So let's say that I have a negative 4 and I'm going to take away 2. Well, my students would know that the way I put the numbers, that means it means subtraction and not just a negative number. So I've got my negative 4. And let's say for some reason students told me they wanted to start off with 1 neutral. Well, if I start off with 1 neutral, then this problem is going to be a little bit difficult. But I would say, okay, I've got my neutral over here. I've got my 4 negatives that I started with. And I want to take away a positive 2, but I don't have enough neutrals to do it with. So you want to get your students to understand that you can put in as many neutrals as you want. It doesn't have to be an exact number. I can have 2 neutrals up there. I can have 3 neutrals up there. I can have as many neutrals as I want to have, as long as I have some to do my subtraction with. So that I have my negative 4, and I'm going to take away a positive 2. And when I do that, if I don't have enough neutrals, I just have to put some more in. So if I take away that positive 2, I said I already had 3 neutrals up there. So I'm going to count what's not neutral. So there's 4 negatives here, 2 negatives there, and that's going to give me negative 6. And so if you let your kids work with the algebra tiles, do the drawing, they will catch on to the subtraction usually pretty fast. Okay? And you've got to go with what they know because it really is for them taking away. So we've still got the takeaways here. And that's basically what there is to subtraction. Now, a lot of people want to teach students rules, and a lot of people say you change the sign of the second number and make it positive. I don't think that teaching kids rules really gets them to understand the concept. The idea behind the algebra tiles is to understand the mathematics. Now, not that my students don't eventually go to a rule, but we develop the rules. So after you've been doing the algebra tiles for a while, you want to actually set up some examples so kids can see the combination of what subtraction looks like and what addition looks like, and then develop the rules for the students.